We start off by looking at our core objectives for today's lesson. Firstly, we look at understanding the roles and responsibilities of the architect. We look at some of the critical thinking when it comes to style, as well as the ability to identify style and the style characteristics. We also start developing knowledge in pioneering and influential people in the design and architectural industry. But before we start, let's take a little look at a quote. Architecture is really about well-being. I think that people want to feel good in a space. On the one hand, it's about shelter, but it's also about pleasure. This is a quote by Harmonize. Architects and interior designers were traditionally somewhat territorial when working together on projects, but that is starting to change. The exterior design and building creation cannot be separated from that of its interior. We take our first steps of our lesson today by looking at the architect versus the designer, what the roles and responsibilities are on our project. There is a lot that we can learn from architecture. In fact, it forms the foundation to what we learn as interior designers today. If there's anything famous architects have taught us, it is that never underestimate the power of design. Iconic architects such as Frank Gehry and Zaha Hadid became famous for their intuitive thinking, out-of-the-box approach, and iconic projects. But the legacies that they leave behind is far greater than that. It is in their processes and in their words that they leave, which inspires us today. As we know, architects and interior designers have different responsibilities when it comes to the project that they may be working on. Architects are responsible for the following: the external elements of your building, the structure and facade of your building. They determine how it will look and feel and often set the tone for the whole project. They also indicate the vital building systems and where they will be located on your project. Then we jump to the interior designer's responsibility. We are responsible for any internal elements of the building. We are responsible for internal structures of the building, such as internal walls, doors, and partitioning. Interior designers determine the look and feel internally, but take cues from the external look and feel of the building. And last but not least, interior designers indicate where the internal vital systems are located. To become an architect, one would generally need to obtain a bachelor's degree in architecture and complete some sort of internship or practical experience within the architectural industry. An architect's role is to set up and develop construction plans for various spaces and projects relating to the facade and sometimes even the internal aspects of the space. As an architect, you would typically find yourself working in an office space for an architectural firm or an engineering firm or even developers. This work is predominantly an office-based job, however, can require some on-site work and travel work. Let's take a look at some of the characteristics you would find in a typical architect. They are generally really good at analytics and analyzing as well as problem solving, so they can help develop the design plans that fit the client's needs and budgets while also adhering to the building regulations. They are generally very technically driven, which ties into their problem solving ability. They have great attention to detail as well as have good creative and artistic talents, which enable them to come up with new and original designs. So as we know, an architect has some responsibilities while on the job. Let's take a look at what they are. Firstly, they are responsible for attending meetings with clients. They are in charge of reviewing the project needs and preparing a design proposal as well as a budget plan. They need to review building codes and applicable regulations, as well as finalize the contracts with the construction crew and contractors. And lastly, they would be required to travel to the building sites and inspect the construction progress. Then we move along to the interior designer. The interior designer is a creative professional who uses his or her artistic sense to determine how to set up an interior space. They generally have some sort of formal training. Interior designers may do some of their work in office, but also need to travel to the location that they are designing. Let's take a look at some of the job responsibilities of an interior designer. They need to meet with potential clients, as well as assess the project needs. They need to prepare project design proposals and present project budgets to the client. They also need to understand building codes and regulations, as well as secure and source materials that may be needed for the project. The first step towards a successful design project is continuity. Harmony and continuity between exterior architecture and interior spaces creates special design in its own. The importance of this idea cannot be overstated. When done well, it creates an atmosphere reflecting the lifestyle and personality of the homeowner or the client. As you can see, there are many similarities between what we as interior designers and architects are responsible on each project. That is why we need to create a harmonious working relationship and encourage continuity through all of our projects. The next section of this lesson is to look at the important elements of architecture. Architecture is a really important topic to understand in your journey to becoming an interior designer. There are so many topics that can be covered when it comes to architecture, but for today's lesson, we are going to look at some of the pioneering features and aspects. A great place to start is the characteristics of prominent architecture styles. We as designers need to be able to assess and analyze these styles and identify them in our everyday lives. There are many styles, but these are your more prominent ones. Firstly, we have the modernist architecture style. Then we look at Baroque and the Bauhaus architectural style. We have neo-futuristic, Renaissance, Gothic, and last but not least, your Tudor architectural style. We're going to break them up. But before we do, you may notice that these style types are similar to that of the interior design periods and styles that we've covered. This is because they develop together. Remember, architecture is a much older profession than interior design. These style types and characteristics are so important for the exterior facade of the building of the time and really an important factor to interior spaces as well. Some of these building styles are still prevalent today, and therefore knowing the characteristics of each style will assist us in harmonizing the interior and exterior throughout all of our designs. We first start with our modernist architectural style. This style emerged and presented itself in the 20th century, as we see with the modernist movement within our interior design styles. The concept that stands foundation to the style is the logical and rational approach to the construction. The modernist architectural style embraces rational, minimalist, practical principles based on the design techniques. Modern architecture was the go-to architectural style for corporate government buildings and institution buildings from 1930 to 1970. As we learned in our interior design styles, can anyone tell me what brought this movement towards modernism in the 20th century? Which style brought this modernist movement to life? This movement came about in rejection to history and historical influences. It came about in favor of the new form and new style. As with all of our styles, we need to look at the characteristics that are applied and identify and apply these styles to our creations. Here are some of the characteristics of your modern architectural style. Firstly, we see that form follows function. Modernism calls for a logic and rational design approach. The phrase form follows function is the defining phrase of this modern style. This is the idea that architecture is driven by logic and form as opposed to artistic expression. We then see a lack of ornamentation. Decorative moldings and elaborate trims are eliminated, which allow space for clean aesthetic design. We see rectilinear form. This style encompasses the use of horizontal and vertical lines. Spaces and buildings are box-like and very rectangular. We then see a movement towards flat and horizontal structures, flat roofs and an emphasis on horizontal planes and broad roofs overhangs. We then see the use of industrial materials. Steel columns are used in exposed applications. Concrete block is used as a finished material, as well as concrete floors and stained exposed steel trusses. We then notice the use of natural materials. Wood is often stained rather than painted to express its natural characteristics. We then see the movement towards external versus internal. The use of large expansive glass paneling, which brings the exterior of the building interior and allows us to take the most advantage of the views and natural landscaping. We then also see an incredibly open concept. Living spaces are no longer defined by walls, doors, and hallways. Living, dining, and kitchen spaces tend to flow together as a part of one continuous space. Have a look at this example and see if you're able to identify some of the modernist architectural characteristics that we've just looked at, or simply jot them down in your sketchbook. What are the defining characteristics that you can see in this image? So the characteristics that you are looking for is, I can see very clean and bold lines in the way the building has been constructed. Obviously, there is a lack of detail and ornamentation on the building as it's very clean and simple. Can you see the rectilinear form in the structures protruding from the front of the building? And I can also see the use of natural materials in the concrete finish that has been left exposed. Did you guys pick up these features? I hope so. If not, you are welcome to use this to jot down in your sketchbooks anyway. Can anyone remember when the Baroque architecture style developed? Think back to your lesson on styles. Can anyone remember when this Baroque style developed? So, it developed in the 16th century in Rome and rose during the period of transition of the Roman Catholic Church. Can you remember the first defining characteristic of this Baroque style? The answer you're looking for is that it was an incredibly dramatic style, not only in the interiors but in the architecture as well. This style was not for the ordinary, as it was grand and dramatic. It was often used in your churches and palaces. It was a style that one used when creating statement and to show off wealth. An important Italian Baroque architect was Carlo Maderno, who lived from 1556 to 1629. He oversaw the early Baroque additions to the St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Let's take a look at some of the characteristics of this style. We see that the Baroque style architecture was linked to the Counter-Reformation, celebrating the wealth of the Catholic Church. It was characterized by new explorations of form, light and shadow, and dramatic intensity. It was an incredibly flamboyant style, which incorporated materials such as glass, marble, and a lot of color. It also includes the use of domes, pillars, and columns within its structures. Having had a little look at the characteristics, can you identify the characteristics that we've just discussed in this image example? What are the typical characteristics that we're looking for here? So firstly, we notice the flamboyancy, which is indicated through all of the detailing within the building. I can also see the use of marble almost throughout the entire building. Did you notice the use of domes and pillars within this image? It's an incredibly beautiful building and very characteristic of the Baroque style. The next movement we look at is the Bauhaus movement, which is probably one of the most prominent movements of its time. The Bauhaus movement is a really important style to study as an architect and an interior designer when it comes to implementing the modern style of architecture today. Bauhaus is a Germanic architecture style which came to life in the 1900s. It didn't gain much popularity at the time outside of Germany. The Bauhaus, or the Bauhaus movement, is actually the name of a school that taught this famous style of design and architecture. The school was called Steicherliches Bauhaus. Founded by Walter Gropius, a German architect and widely seen as one of the pioneering members of modernist architecture, the Bauhaus school literally translates to construction house. The iconic thing was that this school didn't even teach architecture, but had a huge impact on the modern design, modern architecture, and art of its time. They explored the teachings of Bauhaus and the fundamentals through artwork and painting. This school insisted on using only primary colors such as red, blue, and yellow for the vast majority of their artwork. The core concept of this style was to unify the practical design elements and fine arts. The unique feature of Bauhaus style is the usage of a limited number of clean colors. There are mostly whites, blacks, reds, yellow, and gray. The architecture had distinct geometrical and functional values more than anything else. So that was the defining characteristics, your colors and your geometric shapes. So then what makes this Bauhaus movement such an important one in relation to modern style of architecture? The Bauhaus movement has a style incorporating very simple geometric shapes, coupled with your primary colors, your red, blue, and your yellow, as well as shades of gray and black. These were the characteristics in almost every artwork and project of the time. This was indicative of the look of Bauhaus. The main concept of this period was to create accessible products by moving away from the delicate handmade products, introducing new basic shapes and colors that were cheap and easy to mass produce. The focus here was on universal appeal. The general principle for the Bauhaus style is created by using your geometric shapes, angular lines, and your primary colors. The general principles of your Bauhaus style are using your geometric shapes, your unusual angles, as well as your primary colors. Let's take a look at some of the characteristics. So our Bauhaus movement was very plain. It included a lot of plainness within the designs. As we know, it incorporated your bold primary colors such as red, yellow, and blue. It's a style known for straightforward and simplistic design. It's conducive to mass production. as well as retains the integrity of craft materials, which is quite unusual of this time. It's a style that streamlined its aesthetics, as well as incorporated a certain sense of modernity. Bauhaus therefore favors practical design over beauty. When architect Walter Gropius founded the Bauhaus School in 1919, his utopian manifesto proclaimed that minimalism and a fusion of fine arts and crafts would one day rise heavenwards from the million hands of craftsmen as a clear symbol of a new belief to come. That being said, let's look at some of the iconic buildings of this period. Firstly, we have the Fagus factory. This was a shoe factory for Germany. Gropius designed the Fagus factory as a space that maximized sunlight and fresh air for the workers in order to improve productivity. This was an iconic feature of this time. Then we have the Weimar Museum. This hosts artwork from artists of the Bauhaus movement. Their creations now fill the Bauhaus Museum in Weimar, which boasts the oldest museum collection of Bauhaus work to date. Then we have the Bauhaus des Yeux. This was an asymmetrical propeller-shaped building that was intriguing from an aerial view as well as a ground view for pedestrians. Let's take a look at this example of a modern building inspired by Bauhaus. Can you see the bold exterior shape iconic to Bauhaus? Notice how the lines of the wood continue through the glass into the inside of the building. Simplistic, bold, and streamlined characteristics are shown here, which are iconic to the Bauhaus movement. And that is what makes this such a beautiful building. The next style type we look at is your neo-futuristic architectural style. The first signs of neo-futuristic architecture is in the 21st century. One of the prominent characteristics of this architectural style is that it had a lean towards high-tech architecture and technology. We see the method of the nature and science being combined in harmony, as it aims to rethink the aesthetic and functionality of rapidly growing urban spaces. The main look of this neo-futuristic architectural design is noted through a rejection of pessimism and reaching outward towards a positive vision of the future. This is why the futuristic style resembles a sci-fi concept. This movement is more of an avant-garde movement. Let's take a closer look at the characteristics of this futuristic movement. Can any of you tell me what you think, based on what we've just discussed, is the first futuristic characteristic? The first characteristic is an obvious one, and that it is architecture based on futuristic ideals. It's based on futuristic ideals as it's been created around the idea of sci-fi and futurism. It's ultra-modern for its time. We then see the use of strong, long, dynamic lines, which suggest speed, motion, and urgency. It was part of a futuristic movement and part artistic movement as well. Can you see in this example some of the characteristics that we've just mentioned? Can you see the use of bold, curved lines that create a sense of movement? It's definitely not something that one would have seen before in any other form of architecture. A prominent architect that often creates futuristic buildings is our Zaha Hadid, an amazing architect and definitely someone to keep an eye out for. The next style type we look at is our Renaissance architectural style. Can anyone tell me when the style came to life? Think back to when we did our styles in our interior design section. When did this movement come to life? The answer that you're looking for is in the 15th century. During this period, the style left behind the lack of symmetry as it tries to preserve proportion and balance. This is a style that originated in Italy and is still widely seen today. The term Renaissance means revival. This style preserves the tendencies of the Roman, Greek, and classical design. You can find representations of these buildings in almost any country or any city in Europe. This period is where we see the enjoyment of lush and vibrant spaces. So let's take a look at some of the key characteristics of this architectural style. This style has a distinct feature of classic and Roman architecture. It creates a fusion of classical and the 16th century forms. This style featured the foundational architectural concepts such as facades, columns, arches, and vaults. We see the ancient Roman detailing style in this Renaissance period, as well as this being a decorative and ornamental architectural style, which was widespread across Europe. Have a look at this example of your Renaissance architecture. This is the great Renaissance Cathedral of San Pietrone in Bologna. It's on the main square in Piazza Maggiore. Can you see all the characteristics that we have just spoken about? The inclusion of Roman-styled architecture with the fusion of classic forms, the inclusion of grand domes and columns, as well as the decorative and ornamental pieces in the detailing and the lower half of the building. Also quite an iconic and beautiful building. The next architectural style that we look at is our Gothic style, and one that I love and we still see today. This is a European architectural style that was born and popularized in the Middle Ages. An interesting fact about this style is that it does not follow symmetry and the values of symmetry. Some of the iconic features to this Gothic style are the heights of the buildings and the grandiose structures. We see the churches and cathedrals as well as castles being the most representative of this style. A great example of this Gothic style is the Basilica of Saint Denis in Paris. Definitely something to go and research and have a closer look at. The Gothic style is characterized by 5 key architectural elements. Can any of you guess what they are? Firstly, they are characterized by large stained glass windows. We then see the use of grand structures and grand architecture. We see pointed arches, ribbed vaults, and flying buttresses, as well as the ornate decor and decoration within the architectural style. Can you list some of the characteristics of the Gothic style that you can see in this example? You should know what they are as we've just covered them, but let's give this example a go. What are the main characteristics you can see in this example? Firstly, we pick up the grand building or very large and overpowering structure. We then see the pointed arches and the ornate decor within the construction. Did you guys pick this up? I'm sure you did. Let's jump onto our next style, is the Tudor architectural style. This is another architectural style that represents the medieval ages. This style originated in Britain, Scotland, and Ireland. A unique feature of the style is that it uses a combination of characteristics from the Renaissance and Gothic construction types. Some of the features and predominant colors of this period and style are black and white, or another 2 contrasting shades. We see that this style used mostly manors, cottages, and private houses to represent its style. But if you would like to see more of this style, you can visit the United Kingdom, Scotland, or Ireland. Let's take a look at the characteristics of this style period. Firstly, we see that it was influenced by old world styles. It's quite an eclectic style that has asymmetrical architectural values. It's elaborate and decorative in the use of brickwork and detailing on the facade of the houses and homes. We see a lot of black and white schematic colors, as well as the use of pitched roofs. A fun fact of this time, the Tudor homes of this medieval period were sometimes called stockbroker Tudor because of their financially successful owners who had frequently made their wealth in the booming 1920s stock market. Have a look at this example of a Tudor home. Can you identify some of the typical characteristics of the style in this example? Do you get the feeling of a medieval time? Do you see that there is a very elaborate decorative aesthetic style within this house? What other characteristics do you see? Can you see the use of red brickwork and a white and black scheme? I can also see a beautiful pitched roof. Now that we've looked at all of our architectural styles today, can anyone tell me which style do we first see the phrase form follows function? Which style? The modernist style, the Bauhaus style, or our Gothic style? The correct answer is our modernist style. This is where we see the concept of the style, which is logical and rational. It's a rational approach to construction. Hence the phrase form follows function. The next section we look at today is the prominent architect in the architectural industry, and that architect is Zaha Hadid. Have any of you heard about her before? This was an architect that pioneered and led us in her exquisite designs. Remember her quote from the beginning of the lesson? Think back to the prominent elements of her philosophy. Architecture is really about well-being. Architectural Digest quotes, Iraqi-born architect Zaha Hadid from 1950 to 2016 left an incredible mark on the architectural landscape. Her striking structures grace the skylines of major metropolitan cities, while her product design, including furniture, jewelry, lighting, and shoes, can be found in homes all around the world today. The boundary-pushing designer, arguably the most famous female architect of her time, received numerous prestigious awards over the course of her career. Architectural Digest looks back at her amazing contributions to the field of architecture, From her futuristic buildings such as the Beijing Galaxy in Soho, the London Aquatic Centre, and the Guangzhou Opera House to her dazzling super yachts. In the beginning, Hadid's designs did not make it further than the presentation phase of design. However, this was short-lived. Thanks to her determination and inspiring design work, she became known for producing the undoable. Some of her most iconic works are the London Olympic Aquatic Centre and the Guangzhou Opera House in China. Zaha Hadid was also pioneering in the sustainability front. The London Olympic Aquatic Centre was built in such a sustainable manner that it achieved a BREEAM Innovation Credit for the unusual use of concrete mixtures. Like with any famous architect or interior designer, it is important to take a look at their style and characteristics, which made them so prominent. Zaha Hadid's style of work is bold, unique, and contemporary. Hadid was constantly pushing boundaries and limits and therefore never creating a simple design. In her work, we see strong, powerful architecture, often very unique. Her lines are generally curved lines, which are probably the most iconic characteristic to her style. Her style, as we know, is contemporary, bringing architecture to a new level. She creates dynamic forms of long curved shape, which are seen in most of her designs today. Her work was generally vibrant and engaging to the spectator. Hadid pushes boundaries like never seen before. This is the Guangzhou Opera House in China by Zaha Hadid. As described by Architecture Daily, the design evolved from the concept of a natural landscape and the fascinating interplay between architecture and nature. It engages with the principles of erosion as well as topography. As you can see, Zaha Hadid's buildings are very unique, and she's never bland or dull. She always adds life and engaging features to her work. She's definitely one of my favorite architects to date. And that brings us to the end of our lesson of the architect. Let's do a quick recap of what we've just covered. We now understand the role of the architect and the designer on a project. We have covered the roles and the responsibilities of the architect on a project and where they come into play on the project. We look at some of the prominent architectural styles and characteristics associated with each style. And lastly, we look at a prominent architect in the industry, Zaha Hadid. An exciting and extremely important lesson when it comes to the fundamentals of interior design and architecture. Well done, guys. What a great lesson. And as you know, with every lesson, we have our challenge. This is a 3-part challenge. Firstly, we have your research project. Research a pioneering architect in the industry and find out all there is to know about them. Understand what makes them who they are and what style makes them prominent. And lastly, select a building that they have created and analyze it as we have done in this lesson.